April 1918 marked a critical moment for the Western Front. Germany's spring offensive had completely reconfigured the balance of power in France. General Oskar von Hutier was prepping the launch of Operation Georgette, the assault on the Lys River sector that would kick off in just 5 days. British forces of the Third Army, under General Julian Byng's command, were setting up defensive positions along a 15-mile front east of Amiens. Intelligence was everything. Every German troop movement, every artillery concentration, every prep for the assault had to be spotted ahead of time. Observation balloons provided the only reliable aerial surveillance of enemy movements. Suspended at 4,000 feet above the lines, observers had an unobstructed view of miles of territory. The 4th Kite Balloon Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps operated 6 balloons along the Amiens sector. Each one represented a vital observation post and an extremely vulnerable target. Observation balloons were priority targets for German fighters. Filled with hydrogen, a single incendiary round could turn them into a fireball in seconds. Observers always wore parachute harnesses, always ready to jump. Balloon K-17, call sign Kingfisher, was positioned roughly 3 miles east of Amiens. Precise coordinates placed the ground anchor at 49 degrees 53 minutes north, 2 degrees 18 minutes east. The 9th of April dawned with ideal observation conditions. The sky was clear, morning fog that had covered the terrain had completely lifted by 8 a.m. Visibility was excellent. Wind was blowing from the west at 8 to 12 miles per hour. Perfect conditions for spotting any German preparations for the imminent offensive. But what was about to appear in the sky above Kingfisher had nothing to do with the war everyone knew.
Lieutenant Edward Carmichael was 26 years old, born in Nottingham, son of a respected attorney in the community. He'd enlisted in January 1916, when the war had already been consuming an entire generation of young Britons for 18 months. His training as an artillery observer had taken place at Larkhill, one of the most rigorous schools in the British Army. In August 1916, he was assigned to balloon observation operations, a posting that combined technical skill, nerves of steel, and constant acceptance of extreme danger. Carmichael had completed 137 ascensions. He'd survived 2 German fighter attacks, descending by parachute both times while his balloon burned above his head. Among his squadron mates, he was known as methodical, detail-oriented, unflappable under pressure. His observation reports were consistently praised for their accuracy and clarity. He wasn't a man given to exaggeration or imagination. He was a trained observer who documented exactly what he saw. Sergeant Malcolm Rivers was 31 years old, from Durham. More experienced than Carmichael, Rivers had been serving on observation balloons since early 1917. He was in charge of the field telephone, the vital link between the basket suspended at 4,000 feet and the artillery units on the ground that depended on their reports to adjust fire. Rivers was a father of 2 young children. His letters to his wife Elizabeth in Durham revealed a man who fully understood the risks of his job, but maintained unwavering professionalism. Both men had witnessed the aftermath of the March offensive. They'd observed British retreats, abandoned positions, columns of refugees fleeing the German advance. They'd seen casualties measured in the tens of thousands. They'd watched everything war could throw at observers suspended in a basket beneath hydrogen-filled silk. They'd seen the worst that humans could do to each other in 1918. Nothing had prepared them for what was approaching Kingfisher on the morning of April 9th.
At 9:40 in the morning, Lieutenant Carmichael was conducting routine observation at 4,000 feet. Sergeant Rivers was operating the field telephone, maintaining constant contact with ground units. The morning was passing with relative quiet. Sporadic artillery fire from German positions near Villers-Bretonneux, maybe 4 rounds per minute. No aerial activity. Royal Flying Corps patrols were scheduled for 10:30. German reconnaissance flights typically occurred after 11. Carmichael first noticed the light while scanning the eastern horizon with his telescope. A luminous object, spherical, moving toward the balloon. Not from above, as you'd expect in a fighter attack, from the same altitude, directly at eye level. He called Rivers' attention to it. Both men watched as the object closed the distance between them. The object was a perfect sphere, brilliant white with a pale blue luminescence across its surface. It was roughly 15 to 20 feet in diameter, estimation based on comparison with known landmarks on the ground. It had no visible means of propulsion, no wings, no engine nacelles, no control surfaces, completely silent. The wind at 4,000 feet was enough to create audible vibration in the balloon's rigging. German aircraft operating at similar altitudes, the Albatros D5, the False D3, produced engine noise audible from 2 miles away. This object, approaching at 500 yards, made no sound whatsoever. Carmichael's report, dictated to the squadron intelligence officer at 10:47 that morning, described the object's behavior in meticulous detail. It maintained a perfectly level flight path, no deviation in altitude, no oscillation that would indicate atmospheric turbulence affecting its flight. It approached to within 200 yards of Kingfisher. Then it began orbiting the balloon. Clockwise, 3 complete circuits. The first orbit took roughly 90 seconds. Orbit radius, 150 yards. Speed, calculated by Carmichael based on ground references, approximately 40 miles per hour. The second orbit tightened. Radius, 100 yards. Speed increased to roughly 60 miles per hour. The third orbit brought it to 75 yards from the basket. At this distance, both observers could see the sphere's surface with absolute clarity. Carmichael described it as metallic, but not reflective in the way of polished steel or aluminum. The surface seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, yet it gave off its own luminescence. Rivers, in his separately recorded statement, used the term like looking at milk's surface, but glowing. More critically, the object maintained precise altitude throughout all 3 orbits, 4,000 feet, exactly level with the observation basket. No aircraft of the era could maintain such altitude precision without constant pilot correction. The Sopwith Camel, the most maneuverable fighter in service, could hold altitude within plus or minus 200 feet at best. This object didn't deviate more than 10 feet during 8 minutes of observation. But what the object did next defied every known law of physics.
Carmichael started documenting everything immediately, every detail of the object's movement, every characteristic of its appearance, the precision of its orbits, the total absence of sound. Rivers kept the telephone ready to report to command. Both men were trained professionals. They knew exactly what to observe. They knew how to document aerial phenomena. This wasn't panic. This was systematic documentation of something that shouldn't exist. From the ground crew was also watching. Sergeant Thomas Bradshaw, 34 years old, operated the winch. Corporal Lance William Ferris monitored cable tension. Privates David Sutton and Henry Morrison were ready for emergency procedures. All 4 had a clear view of the balloon and the object orbiting it. All 4 would subsequently provide identical statements describing exactly what Carmichael and Rivers were reporting from the basket. In the forward trenches, 700 yards from the balloon's anchor point, Private Arthur Henshaw of the 2nd Battalion Royal Warwickshire Regiment was watching the scene with growing disbelief. His platoon commander, Lieutenant Geoffrey Foster, was also witnessing the event. Corporal James McAllister, serving with the 14th Battery Royal Field Artillery, was observing the object through artillery binoculars from a position 1,200 yards south. Multiple witnesses, different locations, all observing the same impossible phenomenon, all documenting the same incomprehensible behavior. And then, just when it seemed the object would simply fly away, it descended. Hit subscribe if you want to understand how an object could orbit an observation balloon with precision impossible for 1918, because what's coming next reveals how that same object cut through a 2-inch steel cable in a way that defies every technical explanation.
After completing the third orbit, the object descended, not in a gradual glide or a powered dive characteristic of aircraft, vertically. Completely vertical, from 4,000 feet to an estimated altitude of 500 feet in roughly 12 seconds, a descent rate of approximately 200 miles per hour, well above the terminal velocity of any aircraft in a maximum power dive. As it descended, passing directly beneath the balloon, both observers felt the cable shake violently. Then the basket fell, free fall. For 3 seconds that Carmichael would later describe as endless, the basket plummeted toward the ground. Then the descent slowed. It didn't stop, but it decreased to a controlled drop rate of roughly 15 feet per second. Both observers deployed their parachutes, standard procedure for balloon crews. Always wear a parachute harness, always ready for catastrophic failure. They landed roughly 400 yards apart in a field behind British lines. Neither suffered injuries beyond minor bruising. The balloon, freed from its cable, drifted northeast toward German positions. It was shot down by German anti-aircraft fire approximately 20 minutes later. The ground crew of the 4th Kite Balloon Squadron recovered the severed cable within 2 hours of the incident. The cable was 2 inches in diameter. It was composed of braided steel wire capable of supporting loads exceeding 12,000 pounds. Standard procedure required replacement after 6 months of service due to gradual weakening from weather exposure and stress. Kingfisher's cable had been installed 3 weeks earlier. Tensile strength tests performed during installation showed the cable operating at 97% of specifications. The cable had been cut approximately 40 feet below the connection point with the basket. Examination of the break was conducted by Captain Harold Whitmore, Royal Engineers, assigned to RFC headquarters for balloon equipment evaluation. His report, filed on April 11, 1918, described the break as inconsistent with any known mode of failure. The cable had not frayed. Fraying occurs when individual wire strands break progressively under load, leaving splayed ends. The cable had not been burned. Incendiary rounds or tracer fire would have left evidence of heat damage, discoloration, molten metal. The cable had not been struck by explosive projectiles. Shrapnel damage would have created irregular tears with metal deformation around the impact point. The cable had been cleanly severed. Captain Whitmore's report stated, "The break presents as if it had been executed by a precision cutting tool of extreme capability, creating a surface perpendicular to the cable's axis with minimal deformation of the wire strands." The captain noted that achieving such a cut with available tools would require the cable to be stationary, under minimal tension, accessible to cutting equipment capable of shearing through 2 inches of steel. None of these conditions existed at 4,000 feet above a battlefield. Testimonies started piling up immediately. Private Arthur Henshaw provided a statement to his commanding officer at 11 a.m. He described seeing a glowing sphere moving around the balloon, then dropping in a straight line like a stone. His platoon commander, Lieutenant Jeffrey Foster, corroborated the sighting. Foster's report noted that the object maintained luminosity even under full daylight, suggesting internal light source rather than solar reflection.
Corporal James McAllister, observing through artillery binoculars, had documented the precise circular movement, perfect altitude maintenance, vertical descent of speed inconsistent with controlled aircraft flight. The ground crew, the 4 men responsible for operating Kingfisher's winch, had witnessed the entire event. All provided statements that afternoon to squadron intelligence. Sergeant Bradshaw included a critical detail in his statement. The winch showed no increase in load immediately prior to failure, suggesting the cable was not pulled or stressed beyond normal parameters. The cable hadn't been subjected to excessive tension. It hadn't been yanked from above. It hadn't been cut by friction or wear. It had simply separated, cleanly, as if something had cut it with surgical precision from below. By 2 p.m. on April 9th, 11 separate reports had reached RFC headquarters at Bertangles. The pattern was clear. Something had been observed by more than 20 military personnel across multiple units. Something that behaved in ways no known aircraft could replicate. Something that had apparently caused catastrophic equipment failure that shouldn't have failed. Command's response was immediate, absolute, and would reveal the true nature of what had occurred. Smash that subscribe button if this impossible cable cut is blowing your mind, because the decision RFC Command made to suppress this incident and eliminate witnesses is the most disturbing revelation of all.
At 3:20 in the afternoon, intelligence officers from RFC headquarters arrived at the 4th Kite Balloon Squadron base. Major Colin Ashworth, RFC Intelligence Section, conducted interviews with all witnesses. Those who survived remember the interrogations with absolute clarity. Sergeant Bradshaw, interviewed in 1962 at age 78 by a private investigator, described the process as less interview, more intimidation. Bradshaw recalled being interrogated for over 3 hours. He was repeatedly asked to reconsider his observations. He was pressured to acknowledge he might have been mistaken about the object's movements. When Bradshaw insisted on the accuracy of his account, Ashworth, according to Bradshaw's recollection, stated, "Your account doesn't align with established aerial phenomena. Persistence in this narrative could be detrimental to your service record." All written records were confiscated. Carmichael's observation log, maintained continuously since his assignment to balloon operations, was seized by intelligence officers. His personal diary, kept in violation of regulations but common among soldiers, was discovered during a search of his quarters and confiscated. Rivers' letters to his wife in Durham, written but not yet mailed, were taken from his kit bag. The letters contained descriptions of the incident Rivers had attempted to share with his family. The ground crew was ordered to turn over all documentation related to Kingfisher's operation that day. Winch logs, cable tension records, maintenance reports, everything was collected and classified. Witnesses were separated and reassigned. Carmichael was transferred to the 9th Kite Balloon Squadron operating near Ypres on April 11th. Rivers was sent to the 12th Kite Balloon Squadron near Arras. Bradshaw found himself assigned to the 7th Kite Balloon Squadron in the southern Amiens sector. The official explanation was routine rotation to balance experience across squadrons. The effect was scattering witnesses across 50 miles of front, ensuring they couldn't coordinate testimony or compare notes. But separation was just the beginning of the elimination pattern. The pattern started within 48 hours. Lieutenant Edward Carmichael, 26 years old, from Nottingham, assigned to balloon operations with the 9th Kite Balloon Squadron near Ypres. He documented the Amiens incident in a letter to his father, an attorney in Nottingham, written on April 10th.
The letter described the object, the cable failure, the interrogation by intelligence officers. Carmichael wrote, "They insist I saw nothing unusual, that the equipment failure was mechanical. But Father, I know what I observed. The precision of its movement, the impossibility of the cable break, these aren't errors of perception." He mailed the letter on April 11th from Ypres. It arrived in Nottingham on April 18th. His father, Richard Carmichael, kept the letter until his death in 1953. It was discovered among his papers by Edward's niece in 1999, donated to the Imperial War Museum in 2004. On April 13, 1918, during a German air raid on the 9th Kite Balloon Squadron position, Carmichael was killed. Official cause: machine gun fire from a Fokker D-7 attacking the balloon. He was hit by a single round in the chest. His fellow observer in the basket, Lieutenant Thomas Merrick, was uninjured. The squadron war diary records that Merrick safely descended by parachute after the balloon was set alight. Carmichael's body was recovered 3 hours later. Medical examination noted the wound trajectory was downward, 45 degrees from horizontal. Fokker D-7 attacks on observation balloons typically occurred from level flight or shallow dives to minimize exposure to ground fire. A 45-degree downward trajectory would require the aircraft to be directly above the balloon in a vertical dive. No ground witnesses observed such an attack. The RFC pilot who engaged the Fokker, Captain William Preston, flying an SE-5A, reported in his combat report that the German aircraft made a single pass at the balloon from the east, level flight, broke off combat after roughly 15 seconds. Preston's report makes no mention of a diving attack. No formal investigation was conducted, despite the inconsistency between wound trajectory and reported attack pattern. Carmichael's death was recorded as a combat casualty, another loss in a war consuming thousands daily, another convenient explanation. Sergeant Malcolm Rivers, 31 years old, from Durham, transferred to the 12th Kite Balloon Squadron near Arras immediately after the Amiens incident. He'd written 4 letters to his wife, Elizabeth, describing the encounter. The letters were in his possession when he left Amiens on April 11th. He mailed 3 of the letters from Arras on April 12th. They arrived in Durham on April 20th. Elizabeth Rivers kept them for decades. After her death in 1966, the letters were found by her daughter among her mother's personal belongings. 2 of the 3 letters survive. The third was lost or destroyed sometime between 1966 and 1972, when the remaining letters were donated to the Durham County Records Office. In his letter dated April 12th, Rivers wrote, "The object moved with intent, Lizzie, not random floating like a balloon, not erratic like an aircraft in turbulence, deliberate movement, controlled. And when it passed beneath us, I felt the cable cut. I felt it separate, clean. No vibration, no warning, just separation. They tell me I imagined it. They tell me stress from observation service has affected my judgment, but I know what I saw. I know what happened." On April 27, 1918, Rivers was reported missing after his observation balloon was destroyed during German artillery bombardment. His body was never recovered. The official record states he was in the air at the time of the bombardment, that the balloon was struck by high explosive shells, that Rivers fell roughly 3,000 feet when the balloon disintegrated. His fellow observer that day, 2nd Lieutenant Peter Whitfield, survived. Whitfield descended by parachute, landed safely behind British lines. In a statement recorded 40 years later, in 1958, Whitfield described the circumstances of Rivers' death as irregular. Whitfield stated that Rivers had descended from the balloon approximately 10 minutes before the bombardment began, citing malfunction of his parachute harness equipment. Whitfield remained aloft alone. When the shells struck, Whitfield deployed his parachute and landed safely. He assumed Rivers had reached the ground crew position and taken shelter. After the bombardment, Rivers couldn't be found. The ground crew reported they'd never seen him descend. No body was recovered from the area beneath the balloon's position. Whitfield's statement concludes, "I don't know what happened to Malcolm. The official story says he was in the basket with me. He wasn't. He'd descended 10 minutes earlier. But there's no record of that. The squadron diary says we were both aloft. We weren't, and Malcolm just vanished." The discrepancy between Whitfield's account and the official record was never investigated. Rivers' remains listed as killed in action, body never recovered. Coincidences.
Sergeant Thomas Bradshaw, 34 years old, from Manchester, ground crew for the 7th Kite Balloon Squadron, reassigned after the Amiens incident. He'd operated Kingfisher's winch. He'd felt no increase in cable tension before failure. He insisted in his statement that the break occurred instantaneously, without warning. Intelligence officers interrogated him for 4 hours on April 9th. He refused to alter his account. On May 3, 1918, Bradshaw was found dead in his quarters. Official cause, self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. His service revolver, fully loaded minus 1 discharged round, was found near his body. Squadron mates reported Bradshaw had shown no signs of distress, hadn't expressed suicidal thoughts, had received letters from his wife indicating the family was fine. The inquest into his death lasted 6 hours. Verdict: suicide while of unsound mind, attributed to accumulated stress from service. His personal effects, scheduled to be returned to his widow in Manchester, never arrived. Records indicate the effects were dispatched on May 7th. They were never delivered. No explanation was provided to the family. Corporal Lance William Ferris, 23 years old, from Liverpool, ground crew who'd monitored cable tension during the incident. He died on June 18, 1918, in a transport accident. An army lorry overturned on a road near Arras. Ferris was one of 7 men in the back. He was the only one who died. The accident report attributes his death to skull fracture caused by impact with road surface. The other 6 men in the lorry survived with minor injuries. None could explain why Ferris had been thrown from the lorry while the others remained inside. The driver reported the overturn occurred at low speed, estimated at less than 15 miles per hour. The circumstances causing only Ferris to be ejected from the vehicle were never determined. Private David Sutton, 20 years old, from Leeds, ground crew present during the sighting. He survived the war, returned to Leeds in January 1919, started working at a textile factory. In March 1920, he spoke publicly about the Amiens incident during a veterans gathering at a local pub. Several witnesses remembered Sutton describing the object, the cable cut, the official suppression. On April 3, 1920, Sutton fell from the roof of the factory where he worked. Fall height, 40 feet. He died instantly. The coroner's inquest determined accidental death. Witnesses reported Sutton was performing routine repairs on the roof. No one saw him fall. The roof had 3-foot safety railings along all edges. Sutton would have had to climb over the railing to fall.
Private Henry Morrison, 19 years old, from Birmingham, the youngest of the ground crew who witnessed the incident. He survived the war, returned to Birmingham in February 1919. In 1923, he attempted to publish an article about his war experiences in a Birmingham local newspaper. The article included a description of the Amiens incident. The article was rejected by the editor. Morrison tried 3 other newspapers. All rejected publication. In August 1923, Morrison received a visit from 2 men who identified themselves as representatives of the War Office.
The men warned him that public discussion of certain wartime incidents could result in prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. Morrison never attempted to publish about the incident again. He lived until 1971. In his later years, according to his grandson, interviewed in 2006, Morrison occasionally mentioned the day something cut the cable from below, but refused to elaborate. He said he'd signed documents. He said he'd promised silence. He never broke that promise publicly. Lieutenant Jeffrey Foster, 28 years old, platoon commander who'd corroborated the sighting from the trenches. He survived the war, remained in the Army after the armistice. In 1927, he was found dead in his residence at Aldershot. Official cause, carbon monoxide poisoning from gas leak. The inquest determined a faulty gas valve in his stove had allowed gas to accumulate overnight. Foster lived alone. His body was discovered by his Batman 2 days after his death. The coroner noted the windows of the residence were open, which would have allowed ventilation of the gas. The concentration of carbon monoxide required to cause death with ventilation present was never satisfactorily explained. Corporal James McAllister, the gunner who'd observed the object through binoculars, was discharged from the Army in 1919 due to wounds suffered in October 1918. He returned to Scotland. In 1931, during a conversation at a pub with other veterans, he described the Amiens incident. A local journalist was present. The journalist wrote a brief article for the Edinburgh Evening News. The article was published on March 24, 1931. 3 days later, the newspaper published a retraction stating the earlier article contained inaccuracies based on unreliable memories of wartime events. McAllister died on April 2, 1931. Heart attack. He was 42 years old. He had no history of heart problems. The pattern was undeniable, but it wasn't over yet. Some testimony managed to survive. Carmichael's letter to his father remained hidden for decades. Rivers' letters to his wife were preserved by a family that didn't fully understand their significance. Whitfield's 1958 statement was recorded by an independent investigator before it could be suppressed. The 1962 interview with Sergeant Bradshaw provided details that didn't appear in any official records. These fragments, scattered across family archives, museum collections, private interviews, represent all that remains of direct testimony. The official documents remain sealed. The original reports filed by Carmichael, Rivers, Foster, and other witnesses are held at the National Archives at Kew under reference AIR/2126/207/73/18. Classification restricted, sealed until 2044, 126 years from the incident. Attempts to obtain release under Freedom of Information laws have been consistently denied. In 2015, military historian Dr. James Hendricks petitioned for partial declassification. The request was reviewed by the Ministry of Defense. The response, after 14 months, stated release of the requested material would be contrary to the public interest and could compromise national security. No further elaboration was provided. The public interest argument wasn't explained. How documents about events from over a century ago could threaten national security was never addressed. But the pattern didn't end in 1918, not even in the decades after. The Amiens incident occurred on April 9, 1918. By June 1918, 8 of the 23 documented witnesses were dead. By 1920, 12 were dead. By 1931, 16 were dead. Statistical analysis conducted by investigator Martin Hendricks in 2003 calculated the probability of this mortality rate among a group of military personnel with their service profiles at less than 0.004%.
These weren't men in a single unit suffering collective casualties in a single battle. These were individuals scattered across different squadrons, different regiments, even different theaters after the war ended, yet they died at a rate that defies statistical probability. Combat, accidents, suicides, illnesses. The official causes varied, the pattern remained consistent. Investigators who attempted to document the case decades later faced similar obstacles. In 1968, British journalist Michael Thornberry began investigating unexplained aerial sightings during World War I. He located references to the Amiens incident in Imperial War Museum archives. He tracked down survivors. He obtained Whitfield's 1958 statement. He found Bradshaw's 1962 interview. Thornberry was preparing a book on the subject. In January 1970, his London residence was broken into. His office was searched. Documents related to his investigation were stolen. Notes, recorded interviews, archive copies, everything was taken. Nothing else was stolen. His office equipment, his personal effects, his recording equipment all remained intact. Only the investigation was targeted. Thornberry reported the burglary to police. The investigation led to no arrests. Thornberry attempted to reconstruct his work from memory and backup sources. In March 1970, he was hospitalized after collapsing at his residence. Doctors diagnosed acute heavy metal poisoning. The source of the poisoning was never determined. Thornberry survived, but suffered permanent neurological damage. He never completed his book. In 1989, Canadian investigator Robert Mackenzie obtained access to Canadian military archives containing references to unusual aerial observations by Canadian troops during World War I. One document mentioned the Amiens incident, describing reports of luminous object observed by British forces near Amiens in April 1918.
Mackenzie requested related documents from British archives. His request was denied. He traveled to London to investigate in person. On November 23, 1989, Mackenzie was struck by a vehicle while crossing a street in Kensington. The vehicle didn't stop. Mackenzie died from his injuries 3 days later. The driver was never identified. Witnesses provided conflicting descriptions of the vehicle. The police investigation resulted in no arrests. The files Mackenzie had compiled during his investigation were in his hotel room. After his death, the hotel reported the room had been cleaned according to their standard protocol. Mackenzie's personal effects were packed for shipment to his family in Canada. The investigation files weren't among the effects returned. The hotel couldn't explain what had happened to the documents. The suppression pattern established in 1918 remains operational more than a century later. Investigators who dig too deep find archives suddenly restricted. Freedom of information requests are denied on security grounds that make no logical sense for century-old events. Documents that should be public remain sealed. The machinery of suppression established during the war continues operating. April 9, 2026 marks the 108th anniversary of the Amiens incident. On that date in 1918, 2 observers watched something orbit their balloon at 4,000 feet, then cut the cable holding them in the air. The date has taken on significance in certain research circles, retired intelligence analysts, military historians, private organizations tracking aerial phenomena. There are indications that April 9th may witness renewed attention to the incident. Recent declassification of limited RAF documents has revealed references to unexplained aerial observations during spring 1918 operations. The documents don't provide details, but confirm such observations were recorded and classified. Whether April 9, 2026 will bring greater revelation or simply another anniversary of suppressed testimony remains to be seen. But for those who recognize the pattern, for those who understand what was witnessed and systematically buried, the date carries weight.
Drop a comment and hit that subscribe button if this video changed your perspective on what really happened in World War I skies, because every week I break down the incidents governments classified and the witnesses who were systematically eliminated to maintain silence.